So today's video is going to focus on community ecology. So we'll be looking at another equation as well as things that when we change the community and we change the surrounding populations, the ecosystem, how that will impact the community. There is going to be described as it's measuring and describing the species that are within that community. Remember, a community is a group of species living or groups of populations living in one particular area. So by species composition, we're literally talking about the species that are going to make up that particular community. So for instance, if you look at this first picture here with community 1, we can see that we've got 4 different species of trees, as well as in community 2, we have those same 4 different species of trees. So that would be our species composition, these species A, B, C, and D of these trees. And then our species diversity is going to be measuring the species richness, which is my number of different types of species within that community. So for example, both of these communities have 4 different species. So that would be my species richness. And then my species my relative abundance is going to be the amount of each different type. So my overall diversity, I'm going to be looking at these 2 things. I'm going to be looking at the number of different types of species and then basically how those species are spread out. So our amount of each different type. So for instance, these 2 communities, while they both consist of, they're the same species composition, they have the same species richness, they have a different relative abundance. Okay, we can see how in community 2, the relative abundance of species A is much higher. So we have an equation called Simpsons diversity index that is used to basically measure the community structure. So the equation itself is right here, 1 minus, remember this is our sum. So our sum of the total number of organisms for a particular species over the total number of organisms of all species. So for example, in that last one we just had with the trees, right, we would have 4 different, let's say there was 100 trees in total. And for that first community, there would be, that first community, they were evenly distributed. So it would look something like this, right? The number of species C over the total number within the community as a whole. And we had 4 different species there. So our equation will end up looking something like that. Okay, this equation is on your formula chart, so it's nothing you would need to have memorized. It is on the formula chart as well as this information is on the formula chart as well, what lowercase n and capital N are. So this portion of it, the sum portion here, when we're taking the number of organisms of the particular species over all the species and squaring it, that's going to calculate a probability for us. And it's going to calculate the probability that 2 species, if I select 2 species from the same community, really it should say organisms. If I select 2 organisms from the same community, basically the probability that they will be the same species. Okay, so again, it's looking at the probability of selecting 2 organisms from the same community, and you're looking at the probability that they're going to be the same species. The lower that number is, the higher the diversity is. Okay, so our particular equation is 1 minus that probability. So what that's telling us here is that a higher number, I have more diversity because it's the probability that they won't be the same. So again, think about what you're subtracting here, right? I'm subtracting my probability that the 2 organisms are going to be the same species that I selected. So I'm subtracting that probability, which leaves me, right, my leftover probability is that they won't be the same. So the higher that number, the more diverse it is. Again, the higher my probability that they won't be the same. Okay. Keep in mind too that probabilities are always between 0 and 1. And so your answer for this should always be between 0 and 1. So we're going to look at an example for this, and we'll obviously manipulate this in class as well. Okay, so let's look what we have here going on with this community here. So I have 5 different species within that community for a total of 246 organisms. Okay, remember it's N over capital N. So species 1, 65 divided by my total species squared. I'm adding the sum of that for all 5 species. So I go through and I do it for all 5 species there. Okay, and so what that will give me is I end up with 1 minus 0.2615, which gives me a Simpsons diversity index of 0.7385. So let's talk then again about what these numbers mean, right? So this probability right here, the 0.265, right? That's the probability that the 2 species would be the same. Therefore, when I subtract that from 1, I get my probability that the 2 species will be different. And so in this particular community, I have a pretty high diversity index, this 0.7385, or 73.85% chance that the 2 species will be different that I pull. And the higher my diversity index, the more stable the community is. And so this community, again, has a pretty high diversity index, which would lead us to believe it is a pretty stable. So we're going to shift gears now to looking at, changes in relationships within the community and how those impact the community. So the interactions between the populations are going to affect how each population is able to access energy and matter within the community. So how it can access carbon and nitrogen and oxygen, as well as energy, food. Okay? And so you can have both positives and negative interactions within that community, right? We can have predator-prey interactions within that community, trophic cascades. So looking at your how one organism can impact others, and not just by being a predator-prey, how it can basically travel down the food chain. We'll actually watch a video about wolves in Yellowstone and how introducing wolves back into Yellowstone National Park impacted everything down the food chain, not just the organisms that they ate, as well as niche partitioning or resource partitioning, so that organisms can kind of carve out their own little area where they are accessing the resources and not having to fight for the resources so much. Okay, so we're going to kind of look a little bit closer at each one of these kinds of interactions here. So our first one being predator-prey. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind with predator-prey, as you can see on the graph there, is that predator-prey will fluctuate, and they will fluctuate together. So if one goes up, then the other one, well, if the prey goes up, so let's look here. The blue is the prey, the hare, and the red is the lynx, which is going to be my predator. So as my prey levels go up, my predator level will follow behind it and start to go up. So when my prey levels drop, my predator, again following behind it, will start to drop. Okay, so they fluctuate together based on these interactions. And as a whole, that can impact the whole community, right? The amount of hares that I have in the community can impact other organisms other than just the lynx. So their predator-prey relationship can impact. Okay, so let's look at trophic cascades. So trophic cascades is what we were talking about before with the wolves, is that the predators limit the density of the prey, and they can impact the behavior of the prey. So they limit both density and affect behavior. Maybe I should say and. I don't know why that says of the prey, which will then in turn impact the levels below the prey. So, for example, the prey that the wolves were impacting, in addition to culling some of the numbers by eating them, they were also chasing them back into the forest. So they weren't eating so much of the meadow grass. And so then the meadows were having a chance to come back, which allowed other organisms below the prey to then increase their survival. Okay, the next one of these interactions here is our niche partitioning. Okay, our niche is the organism's role in the ecosystem. So basically, what is its job within the ecosystem? And within that niche, that's going to include whatever resources they need or they use to complete that job. And so, what that comes down to is I've got two organisms here. They cannot occupy the same niche. I can't have two organisms that are consistently fighting for resources. One is eventually going to win, and it can end up leading to complete exclusion of the other one. The other one can end up dying out. So, what this niche partitioning does, which is also sometimes called resource partitioning, is it's going to allow for these similar organisms to exist in the same community. It divides it up. So, for example, if you look at this picture here of these birds, you'll see how the flamingos are at the deepest and then the ducks. They've partitioned the beach out so they're not all fighting for the exact same thing. Okay, there's an example with lizards in the Caribbean, and you have one species that lives kind of out on the branches, one that lives up in the canopy, one that lives on the trunk, one that lives near the shrubs below, and so they all have these slightly different locations, and so it allows them again not to be fighting so much for the resources. You could also do this with activity times. Like for instance, you could have one organism be active in the day, and one is active at night. Okay, similar to like birds of prey, like eagles and hawks are more active in the daytime, but owls are more active at nighttime. And so again, they're not competing for the same resources as much. Okay, so let's look at some interactions that can drive our population dynamics as a whole. Okay, remember, population dynamics is our change in the population size over time. So these are going to be things like symbiotic relationships, competitions, things that can impact the populations as a whole. So, for instance, competition is going to do that. Remember, we can have intraspecific competition, intra being within. So, for example, you see that here with these two antelope or elk, whatever those are. Okay, but they're fighting within the same species. So, competition between the same species. A lot of times you see fights for mates and for territory, sometimes for food and for water. Okay, and then interspecific, inter is between. We see this in the bottom corner over here. Okay, so interspecific competition is between two different species. So what usually happens with competition, competition helps drive natural selection. So we need to keep that in mind, right? One of the guiding principles of natural selection is I have to have that diversity within the population, and then I need to have and foster competition. If there's no competition, then there's nobody better suited to the environment than somebody else, right? And so natural selection is kind of driven by that competition. The ones that are the best suited, the ones that win that competition, they're the ones that are able to have babies and pass on their DNA. Okay, I know we've already talked about predator prey, but predation obviously is going to have an impact on my population size over time. When one organism is consuming another organism, right, it's going to be impacting the population of both organisms. The predator is usually increasing at that time, and the prey will start to decrease, which then means, like we showed on that graph before, as the prey decreases, then the predator decreases. So then the prey can go back up, and it just constantly is fluctuating. We also need to think about we also need to think about symbiotic relationships. Okay, so these symbioses, and so again, remember we have parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, right? So mutualism, both parties are happy, everybody gets a benefit, right? This bee is getting nectar and getting food. This flower is getting pollinated. So a benefit for everybody. In parasitism, one organism is happy and one is sad. Remember, it's not getting eaten, it's not getting consumed. That is definitely a difference between parasitism and predation. In predation, the one organism is eating and consuming the other one. The parasite, which is the one that's doing the harming, so it's getting the benefit, the parasite may eventually kill its host, but that's not its goal because then it has to go find a new host, right? So in this example here, we have the caterpillar that is actually acting as the host for all these wasp larvae, which are the parasites. And so those wasp larvae are stealing nutrients from the caterpillar so that they can grow and develop. And then remember commensalism, where one person gets a benefit and the other one is totally neutral. They just don't care. They're not getting a benefit really, but they're not getting harmed. A common example is, as you see the shark here, and then what's called the remora fish. Okay, where the remora will attach itself to the shark. And as the shark moves through the water, it helps the remora go to other locations, get more food. But the shark doesn't care. The remora attaches itself to the shark, but it's not siphoning nutrients off of the shark. And then lastly, we have some of these behaviors can impact our population dynamics as a whole, right? In particular, cooperative and coordinated behaviors, both between individual organisms as well as between entire populations and within the species. And so when these organisms display these behaviors, that can enhance their ability to either access matter or energy. Okay, mutualism is an example of this, right? With mutualism, there is cooperative situation happening between two different species, allowing them both to get a benefit. In the example we saw earlier with the bee and the flower, right? The bee is getting a better source of, it's getting a good source of energy. Okay, and so it's the flowers allowing it access to energy, where then the bee helping pollinate the flower is allowing the flower to increase its genetic diversity. Okay, dolphins, you can see this happening here in the picture over to the side here. Dolphins will surround the mother to help protect it, and then they will actually help carry. Usually the mother's too tired, so they'll help carry the baby up to the surface so the baby can get its first breath. Pack hunting, right? When the organisms hunt in a pack, when the species hunts together in a pack, it allows them to drive their prey a certain direction, approach from multiple ways, which is going to give them better access to energy, right? Better access to food. On the flip side, herd behavior is going to increase the survival of the species. So, working in that cooperative herd behavior for the prey could impact the population dynamics. And we saw, this is the example again, we saw this video, right, in class where the ants were making that raft to protect the queen. Another example again of if their population of ants wasn't working together to build that raft, they wouldn't survive. And so those behaviors are helping them better access their matter and energy. So we'll be working with some examples in this in class. In particular, definitely that Simpsons diversity index, since that's a new concept for everybody. And then we'll continue to practice with this.